Hi, welcome back to another episode of Coldstream Rod Shop. I'm Derek Fraser. I want to introduce you to one of the new projects that came in the shop. Hopefully I mentioned it on some other videos at the end. I'm not sure how our videos are going to go sequentially here because we've got a couple queued up. But this is a 1934 Ford chassis project. It's not straightforward as in just put it together. What the owner has, he has an original 34 Ford frame, completely unmolested, completely original. And what he didn't want it to rust anymore, so he sandblasted the frame and painted it to kind of just save it where it's at. He has his vision of what he wants to do with it. He wants to put a 9-inch Ford rear end like we see on the floor there in the back of it with coilover shocks and a triangulated 4-link, which we've done quite a few times. He wants us to use the original rear cross member to do it, but more than likely we're going to have to add some boxing plates to the side of the frame here to kind of attach the brackets. And then on the front, what he wants us to do is install an I-beam front end with parallel 4 links on the front and a transverse leaf spring with regular shocks, a more traditional style kind of front end. Again, same thing will happen with that. More than likely, we're going to have to box the front of the frame to put the Vega steering box in because it won't actually bolt up to the side of the frame as it is. We need like a flat surface. Likewise, with some of the bolts going through, I'm going to have to put a plate on the back so when the bolt goes through, it holds the bottom 4-link in place properly. So all these parts across the floor, some are from one kit, some are from another, but we'll sort all that out and I'll show you what I did and how I installed it. But for now, what I've done, I've set the frame up on jack stands, more or less level, more or less at ride heights. I'm going to have to tune that up. And then what I'll do is I'll start on the front end. I'll start by installing or mocking up the I-beam, putting the spindles on, setting it at the right angle, and then figuring out where the 4-bar brackets go first. And then we'll work our way to the back. There might be more to it. He may get us to put the master cylinder and a few more things, but ultimately what he wants to do is turn this into a roller. We're not sure yet what kind of engine he's going to put into it, to which he's talked about. He does have a flathead Ford with I think a 39 Ford transmission, which would more or less bolt into the frame as is. But he's also got an early DeSoto Hemi. I think that it's a 291, very early engine. I think it's been rebuilt, not a lot of horsepower. That may go in here as well. So we're kind of have to try and build the frame and a chassis to accommodate either one of those options when he gets it back. So that's the introduction. Follow along as we work on this project. We turn it into a rolling chassis. We are in the process of setting the 34 frame up right now. I'm going to put the front end in first. When the parts came, a lot of them were just bare metal. So what I did, a lot of the zinc plated stuff, the owner had painted some things black. He just basically wants everything black. So I painted the spring perches black and the lower shock mounts black. A couple things are powder coated. So everything's black now before I really got too far. First thing I'm going to do, or I am doing, is I've got only one leaf in. I've got the frame at ride height. The axle is not quite at ride height, but it's I'm going to try to proximate, get it as close as I can. But what I've done so far is from the center of the kingpins on either side back to this pin in the rear cross member. This is how I'm making sure that the kingpins are centered, or they're the exact same distance. That way my front axle is basically square in the frame. So I've pretty much got that to that point. What I'll do is I'm going to put the lower 4 bars on. I'm not going to weld them in place, but what I'll do, I don't know what point the lower bolt goes onto the frame. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure both sides And then once I get a number on both sides, I'll basically weld both of them exactly the same point back here. Because what we ultimately want is that ride height, this lower bar, needs to be parallel to the floor if possible. So kind of work my way through that. I'll probably set this up a few times, make sure, like I said, I want that bar parallel to the floor when the spring is compressed. So with everything kind of loose here and not having, I guess, the specific manufacturer's dimensions on where it hooks in the frame, I'm going to have to figure this out, because I think the brackets in there are back from one manufacturer, the bars are from somebody else, and the bat wings are from another person. So kind of work my way through this. This is where we are so far. Follow along and we're going to get this right. We have some progress now. The lower bars are tacked in place. What I did is I actually compressed the spring up front with these clamps. I don't know if I showed that previously, but the intent being to compress the spring so that it's kind of at a loaded height. So we best simulate where the bars are going to be at ride height. They're not quite parallel to the floor, but that's really as low as we can go. I think what's going to happen is when the wheels and spindles go on, it's going to come up a little higher, so the bar probably is going to be more parallel. So I've done that on both sides. I've got the bar in place. I've double checked my measurements from corner there back to the pin in the back, and I've actually checked the angle here on the axle. We're sitting around, I think, 5.5 degrees. We want to be between 5 and 7 degrees when the car is fully loaded at ride height. So the next step is actually to put the top bar in. Now I've got the top bar in place on the other sides. I'll just explain to you how I find where this hole is. So the bottom bar is in. The top bar needs to be perfectly parallel with the bottom bar. So all I did is I took a 1/2-inch drill, I stuck it in the hole, and then I just did like a compass movement here, and I made a little mark on the frame. Then I took an old protractor here. I set it at 4.5 inches because that's the distance between those two nuts. And then up here, I basically made a line across, and that's where my hole is going to be for the top bolt. Now, it isn't just I'm going to put a 1/2-inch hole there. What I've got to do is actually put a piece of steel tubing in there that's going to go through like that. I'm going to weld that in place on the inside, and then ultimately when I box the inside of the frame, I'm going to put the boxing plate around that. So right now, it might be a little, not quite ready to put it in place just yet, but I'm going to weld that here in a couple minutes. So that'll go through, but I can show you on the other side where it's already in. The camera lady can show you here. I've welded the inside of this tubing to the inside. And then what we're going to do, I haven't put the boxing plates on yet because this is going to be a fully fendered car. So what I need to figure out is where the inner fender wells actually bolt into the frame. And there's holes here, so I'm going to have to weld some threaded nuts on behind these holes before I put the boxing plates on there. Otherwise, not really going to be able to attach everything. So that's why I've just left the tubing exposed. Once we figure that all out, I'll make the boxing plates, put a hole into it, and then I'll weld these around the boxing plates too. So I'll have them welded on both sides of the frame to give us some strength. So making good progress here. Once I have the inner fender wells, or at least where I know where these bolts are, I think over here, yeah, right there. That's a sample kind of what I did. I just take a piece of 1/4-inch steel, I drill a hole in it, I tap a hole, and then what we do is we just put a nut through there and then just tack that in place, and that way you can put your bolt into it and put your inner fender wells in. So follow along, and I'll show you the next step. Next step here is we're going to install, or I just installed the Panhard bar. So with the Speedway kit, there's a bracket that attaches right here on both bolts on the side of the bat wings. And if you can see it here, what I had to do was grind away a relief here for the shackle nut. So kind of ground that away, made it smooth and continuous. So what I'll do is I'll take this bracket off here. I'll probably put a coat of paint onto it. So there is the lower nut for the Panhard bar right there. Try and give you a little bit of a side view right there. And over here, what I did is I've installed the bracket on the underside of the frame right there. Now I've tack welded it for now. The intention here is we're going to take everything apart, lift the frame upside down, and then kind of finish weld it. And if you notice the Panhard bar there, it is basically level with the floor. I still have the spring compressed to basically to simulate the ride height, because ultimately what you want to do is the Panhard bar being level with the ground, or at ride height with all the weight onto it. So I probably repeated this probably 100 times or so when we're doing suspensions and stuff like that, parallel with the floor at ride height and everything else, because that's basically allows for the best geometry of the suspension. So that's it for the Panhard bar. Like I said, all these brackets in the back here and the front. Once I have everything in place, I'll take the front suspension off and I'll completely weld those. Next up, we got, I'm on the floor here. Next up, we did get the inner fender brackets right there. So what I'm going to do is take those inner fender brackets, inner fenders, I guess, if you want to call them that. And now I know basically which ones of these bolts I have to weld a threaded insert in behind. So that's next up. And then once that's done, we'll do the boxing plates on the inside of the frame. So I located the 5 holes that hold the inner fender well on the frame, and then what I did, like I've got it installed over here, got the nuts on it so everything fits well. So you can see over here, up underneath the frame, I've got little 1/4-inch thick pieces of steel that I tapped, I think 5/16 16, so 5/16 coarse thread is what I put in there. So there's 5 of them welded in place. So the nuts are on right now. So next step will be to get some cardboard, make basically a pattern for the boxing plates, and then cut it out and then weld it on. Those are the only 5 nuts that we have to actually do here and be worried about. So now, like when the boxing plates are on, you can just screw through the side of the frame. So here's the paper template I made for the boxing plate, and there is the boxing plate. Didn't really show any cutting it or welding it in place, but essentially this is what we wanted to do, was put a boxing plate from the front cross member up to where the rear cross member started. So it's 1/8 wall or 125 thick mild steel. It's welded all the way across the bottom, across the top, and then, as I said, I welded around the tubing that went through here that this bolt is attached to. So it's now that tubing is welded from both sides of the frame. Both sides are now done. I did realize that I covered up one of the mounting holes for the body, so I'm going to have to come in from behind here and weld in a bung there so that they'll be able to put that in. So that's on the to-do list. That's what happens, the way it goes. Next up, what I've got to do is, besides put that bung in there, is I'm going to put the spindles on, the brake brackets, and then we're going to determine how long the tie rod end is going to be across the front. Once I have the tie rod, then I'll be able to put the mounting plate for the steering box. So these parts, when they came from Speedway, they weren't painted. The other thing I had to do is on the spindles. Anybody that's done this or bought them before, there's a bushing that goes on the spindles that has to be pressed on the spindles. These are 37 to 41 spindles, the most common ones that people use. But this bushing, we got picked up ourselves a press over there. I took a picture of it being pressed on, but that's got to go on before you do anything else. So what I'm going to do now, like I said, I'll put this all together, measure for the tie rod end, and then make a tie rod end up for it, and follow along. We're making progress, like I said. Right now I've got the spindles on, the caliper brackets, and the spindle arms. A couple of things to remember when you're doing this is that the thrust bearing right there goes on the bottom, and any shims that you have to use go on the top here. On this side I actually used 2 5/10 shims, and on the other side I used 3 5/10 shims. Now usually there's a bunch of them comes with the spindles, but this time out we got these from Speedway and there wasn't a lot of extra, so I had extra from the last few times that I did this. I always keep them. If you have extra, you're doing this, especially on any kind of repetitive basis, save them, don't throw them out, because you're going to need them the next time. The other thing I want to point out is that these nuts here that attach the spindle arms, there's a Allen key bolt that goes through here. Use Loctite on them. I have had them come loose on me the very first time I built one, so from here forward, well, from then forward and everything I've done so far, I always make sure that these bolts are Loctited in place, and I even Loctite the top ones even though there's a clinch nut on it, just in case. Don't want them come loose. So that's the spindles, the caliper brackets, and the spindle arms right there. And there's the other side. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out what length tie rod or tie rod I have to put in here, because I was given a blank and I'm going to have to cut and tap the ends. A lot of times, you know, you can buy these from Speedway or Welder Series pre-cut, but this customer gave me tie rods and some blank bars, so we're going to do it the hard way. Two more things I forgot to mention is that when you're putting the thrust bearing in here, make sure you pack it full of grease before you put it on. And after you assemble everything, there are 2 grease fittings, one here and one below. Get your grease gun, just squirt it in there until the grease just starts to squirt out. That way you're assured that everything is good. I always put a little bit of grease on everything before I put it together, but then after I'm done, grease them up, and then just make sure everything is good. So don't forget to do that. So right now I'm tapping the ends of the tie rod and the drag link. I've got the right hand threads done. I'm just doing the left hand threads. One thing I should mention is how I determine the length of the tie rod and the drag link. I cheated, to be honest with you. I went to Welder Series, and Welder Series, they can sell you pre-cut drag links and tie rods. So in my particular case, we were using a 48-inch kingpin to kingpin long axle. So I got this part number, and I determined from their thing that it should be 42.5 inches long. And then also we're using a 33 to 34 Ford frame with a 48-inch axle. Their suggestion is to use that part number, which is 27 7/8 inch long for a drag link. So these guys have been doing this stuff for a long time. They sell this stuff pre-cut, but in my case, my customer gave me the tubing that was not cut and not tapped. So we're going to finish off tapping this. Hopefully you saw previously that we took the tubing over to a friend's place and used their lathes to drill the ends. I tried doing it freehand with the drill and it wandered too much. I should have known better. Best thing to do with this stuff is actually put it in a lathe
and then put the drill in a headstock, and then that way you're going to have a a good alignment onto it. I was also able to face off the ends of both of these rods and make sure they're nice and square. So I'm going to carry on with this. I'll clean them up, I'll paint them, and I'll put them over in the chassis.
After I tapped both ends of the drag link and the tie rod, then I just put a quick coat of paint on all these. Just wanted to tidy it up. We just used some, like we use Rust-Oleum industrial black paint. Cleaned everything up. Degreased it and everything else. Put a couple coats of black paint on everything. It's kind of a utility kind of paint job. That's what the customer wants, but we just want to protect everything. Don't want anything rusty. So the drag link is done. The tie rod I've put in here. Right now the tie rod's in place, and I'm just going through basically aligning it, because essentially, even though we're going to do a little bit of paint touch up, this front end is going to go together, and actually he's going to build a car on it. So right now I roughed it in as far as the alignment went. What I like to do is just put these 18 or 20 inch long bars here on the rotors, and I'm just going to do a sanity check on the alignment. We want about a 1/16 of an inch toe in between the front and the back. Right now I am sitting at 1/8, so I've got to come in another 1/16 of an inch. So I'll make that adjustment, lock these down, grease up the tie rods, and then it's next on the front end, actually I have to position the steering box. So I wanted this in place at ride height first, and then I'll bring the drag link down here and I'll position the Vega steering box over here, weld the bracket in place, and hopefully we'll get the front end kind of tidied up here, ready to go. We'll put the calipers on the front wheels. I also started on the back. While I was waiting for the paint to dry, I had to start on something. So on the back, the lower bars, I positioned the rear end. I think we are, can't remember off the top of my head. Yeah, it's a 112 inch wheelbase on a 34. So the rear end was set at the 112 inches. We've got our 3 degrees on the pinion angle here. I've got a new digital one, so can get right on to 3 degrees. The lower shock brackets here are perfectly vertical with the floor, and then once I had that in place, that's when I tacked these lower brackets in. So what I'll have to do is take this rear end, physically move it out. The customer, when he brought it, he had leaf spring brackets here. I've got to cut those off before I weld in the lower coil spring mounting brackets. So I'm going to carry on with the front end, and the back end will bounce back and forth, and we'll keep on working on the 34 Ford chassis. So we're pushing along here, getting quite a bit done. Got to remember to go back in the house and get the camera lady so I can videotape some of this stuff. But we have the wheels on, the calipers on. The Vega steering box is mounted here and welded to the frame. When you're putting this on, you want to have basically the drag link it's got to be parallel with the tie rod as close as you can get. And then make sure your steering box is dead center. It's 2.5 turns one way or the other, whichever it is, so that your steering arm is straight in the middle, so to speak. So that's in right now. The front end is more or less done, but what I've got to do now is, once I've got the back end done, I'll lift this up, put the rest of the springs in here, because we only have one leaf spring kind of right now, so that we can mimic the ride height condition. So now in the back, what I've done, I've taken the rear end physically out. I've cut the spring perches off of the bottom and ground them smooth, and I've tack welded the lower 4-bar mounts to the rear end. Next up, what I'm getting ready to do is put the triangulated upper 4-links in. So what I did a little mock-up of where the 4-link was going to sit on the shortest side, and then I made a mark here where I've got to put a boxing plate in. So I'm in the process now. I've made the boxing plate up. The owner doesn't want the whole frame boxed up, but we have to box up the areas where we've got the 4 links attaching, and basically put 4 inches or so on either side of it. So I've got the first one done. I also, because we're covering up the body mounting holes, I've done the same thing here. I've made some little tabs here, threaded them. I've put them underneath, and I'm going to weld those in place so that once the frame is covered up, you'll have access to the body mounts. They'll be basically threaded inserts on the inside that you can thread through, because you won't be able to obviously put a nut and a bolt on that once it's all boxed in place. So I'm going to carry on with both sides, get the 4 links in, and then we're going to move to putting the coilovers on after that. So I've got the upper 4 bars in now, or tacked in place. This is much like when we did the Model A chassis, basically a similar process. You know, estimate the ride height of the rear end. This point here of this bolt has to be an equal distance between here and the bar at the bottom as it is from the bolt between there and there. So there's 8.5 inches between this point and this point, and between this point and this point. You basically set these bars up parallel on this axis at the ride height. Obviously, since the top bar is shorter than the bottom bar, as the rear end goes up and down, I mean, it doesn't stay in equal distance, but at ride heights you try and set it up that it's parallel. The other thing is I made sure that the angle is the same on both sides, that it attaches to the frame on the same point at each side, and that the center of this knuckle basically here is directly over the center line of the axle. Just trying to keep the geometry equal on both sides of the frame, and making sure I kept my 3 degrees on the pinion here. So I bought a new electronic angle meter here. It's set up here, it's 87 degrees off of the floor, which is 3 degrees pinion angle, which is what I want. And again, you know, making sure the rear end is centered, so you're constantly going around. As one of the viewers said before, one thing you can do is that when you get the axle where you want it, you could basically weld little bars to put it in place as you're setting all of this up. But right now the next step is I'm going to undo all of these bolts, pull the rear end out. I'm going to finish weld the top and the bottom, so I'll alternate between the top and the bottom so that I have heat on opposite to each other all the time. I won't do like a bead. I will just do a little bit of weld here, do a little weld on the bottom, top, bottom, so I minimize the distortion on the rear end. Then I'll finish weld these brackets in place. Once that's done, I have to trim this rear cross member back so that there's room for the coilover shocks. The customer didn't want a new rear cross member. They wanted me to modify the existing cross member. So I think I've got to come back another 5/8 of an inch to get my clearance to put the coil springs in and put some bolts there. So I'll show you all that in the next few minutes, okay? Here we are a couple hours later. What I've done, I've finished welded the plates here, dressed them out, I've lifted the frame up, and I've welded underneath everything. So all of the bottoms, all the brackets are welded. I've fully welded the brackets on the rear end, the top and the bottom. Also what I had to do, I think I mentioned it, in order to use the original cross member, we actually had to basically narrow the cross member. There's 4.5 inches, I think, between the center of the axle here and this point. So essentially, like I said, I cut it, notched it, brought it back in, re-welded it, put a couple gussets here on either side to basically reinforce the sides here. The original cross member, it is very, very sound, which is kind of unusual for these frames because more often than not they're cracked. But I guess this frame, it's pretty pristine, so it's very sound. The metal here is 3/16 of an inch. It's quite thick. So the next step, or one of the last steps basically to completing the rear end, is putting the coilover shocks in. So again, put the differential here on jack stands at approximately the ride height. Then I have these coilover shocks we got from Speedway. The expanded length I think is like 14.63 inches, and then the ride height is 12.63, somewhere in that magnitude. wrote it down inside. So what I need to do is basically put these shocks at 20 degrees at the ride height. What I did, I went on the internet, I had to cheat and figure out the angle that it was going to be at the expanded length. So where we're at is I have to set these up at 17 degrees. Then when they're compressed, they'll be at 20 degrees, which is the desired angle. So right now I've got my angle finder on here. I've got them set at 17 degrees. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to drill a 5/8 hole through the top here, through this bracket. And then what I'll do is I'll take it away, I'll open it up, and I'll put a piece of steel tubing in there that'll have a 5/8 ID onto it, weld both ends, and that's what we're going to use for our upper shock mount. So here we are. We've got the steel tubes welded in place for the upper shock mounts, and we've got the bolts on. Coilover shocks are in place, and that basically ties in the whole rear end now on the 34 Ford chassis. I went outside and I picked up a couple spare tires here, so we got some tires and wheels on the back. So now we've technically got a 34 Ford chassis that's a full roller. That's it for this episode, putting the front end in, the steering box, and the rear end for the 34 Ford chassis. There's more to come for this project. There's a few more things the owner's talking to me about what he wants me to do, but I'll cover those in a future episode. So that's it for this week. Please like, share, tag, and subscribe, and please send me your comments and questions. And I'll see you next week for the next video. Take care.